You're about to crochet the best project of 2020. If you don't recognize this, it has been heralded as the mascot of the year. It's 100% Soft's Dumpster Fire. You might have seen this art all around the internet. You might be collecting these super cute vinyl toys, and you might be wondering, hey, could I crochet one of my very own? Truck from 100% Soft asked if I might translate his art into crochet, and the answer is a resounding yes. He's so cute, he's so squishy, and he's totally on fire. He has all the details that the original toy does, the original vinyl toy, even little wheels on the bottom. He has a reinforced bottom panel as well, so you can lay nice and flat on top of your desk, watching over you as all your dreams and goals burst into flames. Another added bonus of this project is you'll discover how you can actually make the flames removable, and you can put whatever you want in your new dumpster friend. You'll be using just some basic crochet stitches to make this fella. Single crochet, slip stitch, chaining, nothing really beyond that. However, there are several different pieces that this is constructed with, and sewing them together might get a little confusing. So if you're a beginner, this video is definitely for you. If you're super comfortable with making amigurumi, you could probably fast forward through the crocheting of the pieces and skip right to the assembly. As per usual, I'm crocheting with a worsted weight yarn, and we can get into the very specific materials next.
These are the colors that you'll need for this project. I am using Paintbox yarns. It's a cotton and it's aran weight, which means it's slightly lighter than the worsted weight I usually use, like Lion Brand and Vanna's Choice. For this reason, I'm using not my default H hook. I'm using a G hook. This is a size 6 and a 4mm. Feel free to use whatever size hook you're most comfortable with when you're working with this aran weight yarn, or you can also use a worsted weight. Your project just might end up slightly larger than mine. I feel like any size variation or gauge variation is nothing to worry about. You'll need no more than one ball of each of these colors. We're starting with teal. You'll also need an orange, a yellow, a gray, and just a teeny, like just a smidge of black. If you want to know the exact color names for all these yarns, I'll have that in the pattern, which you can find either in my Etsy shop in a really nice printable version, or free on my blog in a slightly less beautiful version, but free. You'll also need 2 safety eyes. These are 9mm with the backing, a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle for weaving in your yarn ends or whatever yarn needle you prefer. You'll probably want some pins to pin things together while you're assembling. They're very handy. Just a smidge of polyester stuffing. This amount is probably already too much to fit in our guy. He's not stuffed very densely, he's stuffed very lightly, so you won't need too much. Optionally, you can grab some heavy weight interfacing that is used for sewing together things like bags. This is in case you want to enforce the bottom or even any of the sides of your dumpster plush, because what we're trying to recreate is square, and stuffed toys, especially crochet ones, are often kind of puffy. You might want to reinforce some of these planes. I only reinforced the bottom on mine, and the rest of him is squishy, and we'll talk about when to do that and how. But you might want to do his sides as well, just depending on what kind of aesthetic you're looking for. So this is fun to play with, but it's not 100% necessary. Let's start with the front panel. The front panel is the front of the dumpster where his little face will go. And this is a very simple rectangle. Take your teal and your crochet hook and put a slip knot on it. However you put a slip knot on is fine. This is how Amanda's grandma Wendleton taught me to start a slip knot. It's just sort of what I do. There's the slip knot. And you'll begin with chain 13. Let's get a little up close just for beginners who might need a refresher on the chain, once you have your slip knot on your hook, lean back here and yarn over, pull through the loop on your hook, and that's one chain. I'll do that one more time. Yarn over, lean back here, pull through the loop that's on your hook, and that's chain 2. You do a total of 13 chains. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. For these foundation chains, it can be a good reminder, you don't have to chain too tightly. Otherwise, your first row is going to look a lot more narrow than your other rows, and your rectangles won't be quite as straight. I've read that some people even use one hook larger for their foundation chain and possibly their row 1 or just their foundation chain, and I don't like to switch my hooks around that much, but I just kind of keep in mind to not work too tightly on this foundation chain. So here's 13. For row 1, you'll skip the first chain from your hook and work a single crochet in the next chain. So insert your hook into the desired spot, yarn over, pull through the first loop on your hook, yarn over, and pull through both loops on your hook. That is one single crochet stitch. Then you'll move on to the next chain. Insert your hook, yarn over, and pull through one loop, yarn over, and pull through both loops on your hook. There's 2 single crochets. You can see the top of one here. There's one V, and the top of the other one here. It's the second V. You'll keep working single crochets all the way down your foundation chain. Just one single crochet in each chain. Super easy. Crochet all the way down. You should have a total of 12 single crochets here. For the beginning of row 2, we're going to chain 1. That's our turning chain. And then turn the project so that we can now work a row on top of the row we just worked. Row 2 is single crochet evenly, which means one single crochet in each stitch across without any increasing or decreasing. So just single crochet again for a total of 12. At the end of row 2, you should still have 12 stitches across. The rest of the pattern for this front panel is a total of 6 rows of single crochet working evenly across. So you just keep repeating over and over until you have 6 rows. This is my 5th row of single crochet. This is row 6, the final row for the front panel. Your rectangle should look something like that. See, this front panel sort of fits across the front of the actual dumpster toy here. If yours is not exactly the same size, I wouldn't worry about it, but just to let you know my design process, I tried to make sure that my crochet pieces fit the actual sides and shapes that were on the toy. You're going to break this off. You don't need a lot of extra yarn here. To break off your project, yarn over one more time and pull all the way through until the tail comes out, and this creates a little knot. You can go ahead and weave both of those ends in. If you have not woven an end in before, you'll thread your tapestry needle with the yarn tail. You're going to travel your needle in the row that's closest to you. So this is row 1, in between stitches, like sandwiched inside the stitches. And you know you're traveling inside them when you can't really see the tapestry needle on the top or on the bottom. That ensures that you won't be able to see the yarn tail either. I mean, you're going to be able to see a little bit, but this is as hidden as we can get it. So give it a tug. Not too tightly. You don't want to warp your crochet project, but you want it enough so there's not any yarn sticking out anywhere or looping up. Then I'll travel again, staying inside my stitches, 1 row forward, and then across the second row here in the opposite direction as I wove the tail the first time. And this change in direction ensures that your little yarn tail won't work itself out. Or don't pull too tightly, but make sure it's nice and snug in there. And then you can trim this close, being sure you don't chop up any of your stitches. And repeat that on the other side. Next up would be the back panel. The back panel is the back of the toy, or the back of the dumpster. And it is also another rectangle, very similar to the front panel. Again, you would chain 12, and for row 1, skip the first chain, single crochet evenly across for 12 single crochets total, and rows 2 to 10 are simply chain 1 and turn, and single crochet evenly. It's exactly the same, except there's 4 more rows, and you would also break off and weave in both of the ends. Similarly, the bottom panel, which is the panel with the wheels, we will put those on later, is also a rectangle. It is also started with a chain 13. Row 1 is skip the first chain, single crochet evenly across for 12 total single crochets. And again, you're just going to work back and forth, single crocheting evenly until you have 11 rows. It is only 1 row different than your back panel. For this one, you're going to break off, leaving yourself like an arm length of yarn. This is for sewing everything together later, so leave that when you break off, and you can weave in the shorter beginning end. Next, let's make a side panel, which will be slightly different than these, so I'll definitely walk you through that. We're going to make 2 side panels, so one is for here. Aw, my toy's a little dirty. It's been well loved. One side panel here, one side panel here. It'll be the exact same pattern, so we'll be making 2. Start off by giving yourself about an 18-inch yarn tail. This is for sewing later. And then put on your slip knot. Start with the chain 7. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Remember, not too tight. Row 1 is skip the first chain and then single crochet evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. For row 2, we'll chain 1 and turn, and again single crochet evenly across. So that's 6 total single crochets. Remember to count those rows, especially now that we're starting to increase the number of our stitches. You'll want to make sure you're increasing at the correct rate for the correct shape. For row 3, chain 1 and turn, and you'll work 2 single crochets into this first stitch. That would be an increase. So 1 single crochet here in the first stitch, and then work another single crochet in the exact same stitch. It's 2 stitches in 1. And then 5 single crochets evenly for the rest of the row. Count your stitches, you should have 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Perfect. Rows 4 and 5, you're just single crocheting evenly across. No increasing for the next 2 rows. For row 6, we're going to start increasing again. Chain 1 and turn. You'll begin with 6 crochets evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You should have 1 stitch left in the row, and that's where we'll create our increase. So 2 single crochets all in the same stitch. There's 1, and then I'm inserting my hook into the same spot for the second stitch in the increase. Count your stitches, there should be 8. Chain 1, turn. Rows 7 and 8, we're working evenly again. So no increasing. In rows 7 and 8, your stitch count should always be 8 single crochets across. For row 9, we'll be working 1 more increase row. Chain 1, turn, work your increase in the first stitch. 2 single crochets in the first stitch. 1, and then 2, and then evenly across. That should be 9 stitches total. Rows 10 and 11, you'll just be working evenly, no increases. Rows 10 and 11 should both have 9 single crochets. If you're finding that you're splitting strands a lot, you may want to go up to a bigger hook size. So after row 11, I'm going to count and make sure I have 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You should have 11 rows here. I always like to count just in case I missed something. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And you're going to break off, leaving an 18-inch yarn tail. Sort of almost the same length as your beginning one. Just enough to get some sewing done. So I'm going to break off here. And then yarn over and pull through my tail. If you lay this out, oops. If you lay this out, you can see how this shape has that angle on the top. It stays straight on the bottom, the same way the duster does. That side panel goes like that. So make 1 more complete side panel. I've already done that here. Now that we've finished the side panels, let's make some handles. I'm going to grab our teal again and chain 10. 1, 2, 9, 10. Skip the first chain and then work 8 single crochets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That means you should have 1 chain left. And in that chain, we'll work 2 single crochets and increase. It's 1 and then 2. Now we'll work in the opposite side of the foundation chain, kind of making a mirror image of the row we just worked. So you'll work 8 more single crochets evenly down this chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8. What we'll do is we're not going to join, we're going to keep working, and round 2 is 1 slip stitch in each stitch all the way around. So just a very short border. Slip stitches, insert your hook into the desired stitch, yarn over and pull through both loops. It's shorter than a single crochet. 2, 3, 4, 5. With slip stitch in a project, it's often important to remember not to pull your stitches too tightly, especially if you're going to have to work another row or round into that slip stitch. And for these handles, we will not be doing that, but it's a good practice to keep in mind that a nice slip stitch has a lot of control involved. It's not too loose and it's not too tight. And all the way around, 1 slip stitch in each single crochet. If this starts feeling like it's buckling a little bit, or the piece is starting to change shape a little bit, that's okay. That's actually what we want it to do. And that effect will be very slight, but I didn't want you to feel alarmed if you felt like your piece was not laying perfectly flat, because it's really not supposed to. It will curl a little bit. Make sure you've worked 18 slip stitches all the way around, and then slip stitch again into the first slip stitch you worked to join the round. And then break off, leaving 18 inches of yarn for sewing on later. I'm going to pull this through. Ultimately, what's going to happen is we want the right side of your work to show on the outside of the handle, so you'll probably have to flip this inside out just a little bit. There's not a lot to flip. It's such a very tiny, short, shallow piece, but we do want the right side showing on the outside. And whether or not we flatten it or fold it can kind of determine what shape this ultimately is going to be. And when we sew this on, we're going to sort of consciously squish it together and give it more of a three-dimensional handle-y look. And you'll also notice that mine is twisting a little bit, which is natural. It's just going to happen with crochet work. I kind of just try to smush it with my fingers, and when we're sewing it down, we'll be really conscious of trying to keep it straight, but it might be a little wobbly, and that's just the nature of handmade crochet things. With any of these pieces, you're going to get a little bit of wave and curl, especially because we're working in single crochet. It's just what happens to crocheted fabric. If this drives you bananas, you can do something that we call blocking, which flattens everything. And since this is cotton, it's pretty easy to block since it's a natural fiber. And what you do is you get a towel or maybe a foam block or something, and you would lay your crochet piece on top, spray it with a ton of water, like get it soaked. You'll use pins that won't rust and pin everything down into place, like by the corners and maybe like 2 here if you feel like you want some flattening. And as the piece dries, it will dry in this flat shape. I'm usually too lazy to block anything. I never block, especially because I work in a lot of acrylic. It's more difficult to block an acrylic very nicely. You can Google lots of different ways to block knit and crochet items because there's more than one method. You can spray it, you can iron it. There are different combinations of ironing and spraying, so you can look that up and experiment with that. I think it's more important for like garments, less so with toys. If you want perfectly flat edges, blocking might be for you. If you don't mind that your guy's going to be a little bit lumpy and bumpy here and there, don't worry about the blocking. So that was kind of way more than I thought I was going to say about that, but surprise. Okay, what we're going to do is weave in the short end, and then we'll be done with this handle. And I already finished the second one here. Next up is the top panel, which is one of the slightly more complicated pieces we'll be making because I want a teal frame here for the top, and we'll crochet the right side of it solid, but I want to leave a space here to put our flames in later. So we're going to be making a rectangle as we have before, but it's going to have a really big hole on the left side. Grab your teal and chain 13. 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12, 13. For row 1, you'll be familiar with this. It's skip the first chain and single crochet evenly across. 12 single crochets. Think of it as creating, oops, it feels a little skinny. I might have been crocheting a little bit too tightly. This is going to be the bottom edge here of the top. Row 2A, and I'm calling it A because one side of it will be the A and the other side of it will be the B side. So for row 2A, we're going to chain 1 and turn and work 6 single crochets evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Leave the rest of these stitches unworked. For rows 3A to 12A, you're simply chaining 1, turning, and working 6 crochets evenly across. Just building up a solid rectangle just on one side of this project, or I guess one side of this piece. And 12. We're going to break off, leaving an 8-inch yarn tail, so not too long, just a little bit. We need to rejoin teal in this bottom left corner in order to create a really skinny row on this side, on the outer edge of this gap that we're creating. The wrong side of row 1 should be facing you, and the stitch that you're sticking your hook in is actually the first single crochet of row 1. Insert your hook and join your yarn. I'm going to chain 1 and work a single crochet in that same last stitch. That's it for row 2B. For row 3B, chain 1 and turn and work a single crochet in that one stitch. Row 4B is the same. Chain 1, turn, single crochet in that one stitch. You'll do the same thing until row 10B. I would actually try to crochet a little bit more tightly for these tiny rows. For some reason, these stitches can end up kind of being more loosely joined than if they were all squished in a row of stitches surrounding them. Since they're just single stitches, they tend to loosen up a little bit. So I try to make up for that by crocheting a little bit more tightly. And I lost count, so I'm just going to make sure that I'm stopping at row 10B. It looks like I might be a little bit short. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, that's perfect. For row 11B, chain 1 and turn. Work single crochet again, 1 single crochet, and end row 11B with chain 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is going to seem a little weird, but trust the pattern and follow along. We're now starting row 12B, which will close the gap at the top of the space we're creating. Skip the first chain from your hook and then work 5 single crochets evenly in the remaining 5 chains. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're completing this row by working 1 single crochet into the top of the single crochet from row 11B. And this looks really kind of floopy and weird. I'm taking my hook out and arranging all these bits so that I know that I'm putting my last stitch in the right spot to make this shape. So you can see row 12 is kind of hanging out over here. It's actually supposed to look like this, which is a little weird because it feels like you're twisting something that's not supposed to be twisted, but this is what's happening. And our last stitch we're going to work is at the top of row 11B. Here, you need to work your last single crochet into the top of the very skinny column that we just created. Put your hook back in and work that last single crochet. And it was super duper weird. Look how this is working out. I'm going to pull out my hook again just to show you what we're working with here. See how that little extra 5 single crochet in 12B forms the top of this gap here. And all we have to do is use this yarn tail and a tapestry needle and connect these with a couple whip stitches. What you're going to do with the end here is kind of up to you. I'm going to leave it live, which means I'm not breaking it off. I'm going to keep it connected to this ball of yarn, because later when we attach the top of the dumpster to the rest of the dumpster, I'm going to put my hook back in here and use that to sew everything together. If leaving a live stitch is going to make you crazy, you can break this off and weave this in, but know that later you're going to come right back to this spot and stick your hook in it and start over again. So it's really up to you and how many ends you want to have to weave in later. I always try to minimize my end weaving, so I'm leaving this attached to the ball, and I always leave a big loop up here so I don't pull out any of my stitches. Put this on my tapestry needle. Push the top together here. Kind of align the top and the bottom. It looks better if you do this flat, but it's kind of harder to actually execute, so I'm going to pick up the pieces a little bit. And kind of do a little whip stitch here across the top of the stitches. And then I might also join the bottom here. That's it. You can just tie this to secure and weave in this end. And weave in the rest of these ends, leaving this live stitch if you're leaving it live, or weaving that end in as well. The next piece we'll make is what I'm calling the flame bucket, for lack of another term. It's going to begin with creating a rectangle the same size as this hole. And ultimately what we'll be doing is, think of this piece as a kitchen countertop, and the flame bucket is the sink. So we're creating something that kind of like a bowl that we're going to stick underneath here to hold the flame so that it can look like they're shooting out from the inside. Take a look at your pattern. You'll see that it will tell you to chain 6 with your teal. And another note about starting this piece with teal, if you left your stitch live on your top panel, you can either use the other yarn tail on your skein, the other side of it, or if you have a second ball, you can use that. That can come in handy. Or if you don't feel like this, or if you don't feel like breaking this off and you also don't want to use the other side, pull out maybe 5 to 6 yards of your yarn here and then break it off, and that should be plenty for when you need it later. I have a second ball, so I'm just going to use that for now. You'll begin with chain 6 and just making a crocheted rectangle with single crochet like we have been before, except this one is only 5 single crochets wide, and you do that for 10 rows tall. The next step would be to work around a single crochet all the way around this rectangle as we start to build some height for the bucket. Chain 1 and turn. You'll see the acronym BLO in the pattern. That stands for back loop only, and this can be helpful when you want to change direction in a 3-dimensional object. It will flip your stitch kind of more toward the front or more toward the back, and in this case it doesn't matter which way, but I just used back loop only to pick one direction. So you'll work in the back loop only across this whole row. Normally when we work a stitch, we work in both of the loops. And for BLO, just pick up that one back loop, the one that's more towards the back of your piece. So single crochet, and again, just the back loop, not both loops. There's the second one. There's 3, 4, and then 5. Now you'll be crocheting down the long side of your rectangle. For me, this is about 9 single crochets evenly. This is an intuitive thing. You'll start learning where to put your hook when you're working on the sides of stitches. Try to keep 9 as a good target. If you happen to get 10, that's okay, but remember that and also do 10 on the other side when you get there to keep your sides even. You really shouldn't get higher than like 10. If you're squishing in like 11, 12, that's too many. The edge of this will start being too wide, so try to keep your edge stitches to about 9 or 10 single crochets. It's 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, and then 9. And here I'm back down at the foundation chain, and I'll work 5 single crochets evenly across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then try to work 9 single crochets across here as well. 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, and then slip stitch to the very first single crochet of this round to join. Like a lumpy, very shallow tray. For round 2, chain 1, turn. Now working in both loops again of each stitch, work 1 single crochet all the way around. Since I had 9 on each side here and 5 on each side here, I have a total of 28 stitches. Rounds 2, 3, and 4 are actually exactly the same. Just chain 1 and turn at the beginning of each round, and then single crochet evenly all the way around, ending each round with a slip stitch to the first stitch of the round, building up the sides of your little flame bucket. Here I'm slip stitching to the first single crochet of round 2. To begin round 3, I'll chain 1 and turn and keep working those single crochets evenly around. So I chain 1 and turn, and I'm going to start round 4, which is my last round. Slip stitch to the first single crochet to join. I'm going to break off, leaving about 24 inches of yarn for sewing later. It's really kind of approximate. And then you can go ahead and weave in this short end. I always like to check and see if things are looking like they'll all go together at the end as I go. So you can sort of see how the flame bucket will sit inside this hole, just like this. Kind of a weird concept, I know, to grasp that we are doing this weird structure underneath on the inside of our dumpster. But it's going to give us that look that we want. So it's worth this kind of little weird, funky, extra effort. Our flames are probably what looks the least like the toy, the original toy. Ours are going to be made like pillows, basically. You're going to be making two different pillows, a big flame pillow and a little flame pillow. The big flame for me mimicked this large center section here, and I call it a pillow because we're going to make two shapes that are exactly the same, seam around them, and stuff them to give them a little bit of dimension. And then the little flame kind of mimics these two shapes. The little flame will be one piece but have two separate triangular curved sections coming out of them, and then we'll put the big flame in the back and the little flame in the front. So it'll look like two separate pieces, not like sort of one homogeneous piece like this, but I think that our crochet version will be a nice in-between if you compare the vinyl toy with the original 2D artwork. Grab your yellow. Give yourself about an 18-inch yarn tail to start. This is for sewing later. And then chain 7. Row 1 is skip the first chain and 6 single crochet evenly across. 2, 3, 4, oops, getting a little splitty, 5, and then 6. Rows 2 to 4, very similar, chain 1 turn, single crochet evenly across. 4, 5, and then 6. So a little rectangle after row 4. Row 5 is where we're going to start playing with shaping. So this looks less like a rectangle and more like a curvy little triangular flame. Chain 1 and turn. Row 5 is 2 single crochets in the first stitch. So we'll work an increase here. 1, oops, 2 in the same stitch. 3 single crochets evenly. It's 1, 2, 3. You should have 2 stitches remaining in the row, and you will work SC2 together, which is our decrease. Single crochet 2 together. If you haven't done one of these before, it's a super easy way to decrease your stitch count. Insert your hook into the desired stitch, yarn over, and pull through 1 loop. Then insert your hook into the following stitch, yarn over, pull through 1, and then yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on your hook. So you ended up just making 1 stitch, but you used 2 stitches from the previous row. That gives you a decrease. At the end of row 5, you should have 6 stitches. So make sure to count those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. For the beginning of row 6, chain 1 and turn. You're going to work 2 decreases in a row. 1 single crochet 2 together, and then another single crochet 2 together in the next 2 stitches. Single crochet in the next stitch, and in the last stitch, work an increase, 2 single crochets in the same stitch. Now that sounds really wacko, but what's happening is not only are we decreasing our stitch count and narrowing the top here, all those decreases are creating this angle. And then by increasing on this side, we're trying to encourage an angle over here too. For row 7, we'll chain 1 and turn. We'll work another increase here. It's encouraging that angle. It's 2 single crochets in 1 stitch. And then we will work 2 single crochet 2 togethers in a row again. So 2 decreases. Here's the first single crochet 2 together, and then in the last 2 stitches, another single crochet 2 together. And at the end of row 7, you should have 4 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4. For row 8, chain 1 and turn, 2 single crochets evenly, so 1 single crochet each in the next 2. Little knot in my yarn I need to pull out. And in the last 2 stitches here, single crochet 2 together. You should have 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. For row 9, we'll chain 1 and turn, skip the first stitch, and then single crochet 2 together in the last 2 stitches. But you're not done yet. This is a little funky. Work 1 more regular single crochet into that same stitch. You should have 2 stitches here at the top, which would be the single crochet 2 together and then that little single crochet you squished in. Our last row is chain 1 and turn, single crochet 2 together. This is your last 2 stitches. Check out this cool funky shape you made. I know it looks a little random, but it will look very flamey when we're done. Break off your yellow. It doesn't need to be a long tail, just enough to weave in later. I'm not turning my piece. The right side of row 10, which I just finished, is still facing me. We're going to crochet a border of orange across just the top, just these 2 sides. We're going to leave this open and with no orange. After we seam this all together, we're leaving this open so we can put a little stuffing inside. Join orange here in this bottom right corner. It will be the same bottom corner that your first yarn tail will be sticking out of. However you join is up to you. Again, what I do is I put a slip knot on my new color or my new yarn and just pull through to join. Round 1 of orange begins with chain 1, and in the next stitch work a single crochet. Single crochet again into the next stitch. And again, when we're working along the sides of our rows, it'll take a little practice kind of figuring out the spacing and where your hook goes. If you're not familiar with it, you'll just need to keep practicing, keep feeling like how far apart your stitches should be. It should feel just like you're working a regular kind of single crochet row, so you're kind of mimicking that spacing. In the next stitch, work 2 single crochets. You need to work some increases because we have a curvature to come around. Kind of think about like you're traveling on the outside edge of a circular shape. So 1, 2, and work another increase again. 2 single crochets in the next space. 1, 2. For the rest of this edge, you'll work 6 single crochets evenly to get to the top. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. The next stitch here should be your last single crochet 2 together in the yellow, and we're going to make what we call a picot at the top here. And picots are worked with chains and slip stitches, and they help make a nice little point at the top of things. So these top stitches are going to look a little bit weird and a little bit squishy, but we'll work through it. It says to single crochet first. When you have some directions that are all in parentheses, for my patterns that means everything inside the parentheses gets worked in the next stitch. So we're shoving a lot up here at the top. So 1 single crochet, and then chain 3. This is the picot. 1, 2, 3. And there are all different kinds of picots, they're not just one. So this is just one way you can do it. We're going to skip the first chain from the hook and then work a slip stitch, 1 each, in the remaining 2 chains. And to finish this stitch, we're working a single crochet back into that first space. You can see it makes like a nice little pointy bit here at the top. We'll be doing a bunch more of those as we work on all the tips of our flames. After this, you will then 2 single crochet evenly along this next edge. 1, and then 2. So 2 single crochet in the next space. 1, 1 single crochet in the next space, and then 2 single crochet in the space after that. The rest of this edge will take about 5 single crochets evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then to finish off, we'll slip stitch into this corner, which is essentially the first spot in this foundation chain. Slip stitch, and then break off, leaving about 24 inches of yarn for sewing later. Remember to keep that long orange tail you just cut. You'll also want to keep your original long yellow tail from the beginning of the piece and weave in the other 2 shorter ends. You'll make another piece that's exactly like this one. But you don't need to start with a super long tail and you don't need to finish with a super long tail. Your second piece, you can just weave in all of your ends. The little flame is very similar to the big flame, except it's 2 flames stuck together and they're both shorter and thinner. With yellow, give yourself about an 18-inch yarn tail. Put on your slip knot and then chain 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Row 1, skip the first chain, single crochet evenly across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Row 2, chain 1 and turn. 3 single crochet evenly. 1, 2, and 3. You're leaving the remaining 2 single crochets unworked. Row 3A, chain 1 turn, skip the first stitch, single crochet, and then 2 single crochets in the last stitch. 1 and then 2. For row 4A, chain 1 and turn. Increase again, 2 single crochets, skip 1 stitch, and then single crochet. Your stitch count should be 3. For row 5A, chain 1, turn, 2 single crochets in the first stitch, and then single crochet 2 together for your decrease. You should still have 3 single crochets across, or 3 stitches across. For row 6A, chain 1 and turn, skip the first stitch, and then 2 single crochets evenly. 1, and then 2. For row 7A, chain 1 turn, single crochet 2 together. That's your only stitch for this row. Your stitch count is 1. For row 8A, chain 1 and turn, and single crochet. Break off your yarn. It doesn't need to be a long yarn tail. And this side of the flame is finished. You can see we got a tiny bit of curvature in here. And for this second half, there's not going to be a lot of curvature. It's just 2 stitches wide. We want it to be short. There's not a lot of room to work here, but we're just going to get a nice little pointy triangle. With the right side of row 2 facing you, which is the wrong side of row 1, we're going to join yellow again here in the next free stitch to complete row 2. Chain 1 and single crochet into the same stitch, and then single crochet in the next stitch. It's 2 single crochets evenly for row 2B. Row 3B is chain 1 turn and 2 single crochets evenly. 1 and 2. Row 4B, chain 1 and turn, skip the first stitch, single crochet in the second one. Oops, I'm going to redo that. My yarn was getting a little bit splitty on that one. At the end of row 4B, you only have 1 stitch for your stitch count. Row 5B, chain 1, turn, and 1 single crochet. And that's it for this side of the flame. Break off yellow. As with the big flame, we're going to join in this bottom corner with orange and work a border all the way around the top, and we're going to leave this short bottom edge with no orange. The right side of row 1 is facing me, and we're going to join orange in this bottom right corner here in the foundation chain. Chain 1, single crochet in the next stitch, and then 4 more single crochets to get to the top. 1, 2, 3, and 4. At the top, we'll work our single crochet slips, or single crochet picot single crochet. It's looking very splitty up here. You can sort of parse out what you actually want to put on your hook. Here we go. Sometimes how you place your hook can make your project look less splitty because you're not actually splitting your yarn. Single crochet, chain 3, 1, 2, 3, skip the first chain on your hook, from your hook, slip stitch in the next stitch, slip stitch in the next chain rather, slip stitch in the last chain, and then single crochet back into that same stitch. That creates your little orange picot. 4 single crochets evenly down this other side. It's 1, 2, 3, and then 4. It's okay if it doesn't look like you're all the way at the base of this triangle. We actually don't want to work any orange stitches into this little nook. If you do, the flame ends up being really wide and split open, and we kind of want to keep it kind of neat and tidy and vertical. So when I start my border for the bigger side of the flame, I'm actually going to work my first stitch into the side of row 3A, which is about here, like this. And you can see it kind of keeps our 2 shapes together. It does also create this gap, and that's totally okay. We can use this yarn tail to sew that up a little bit when we're weaving in our ends, so don't worry if there's a little gap. To keep going up this edge, I'll work 5 more single crochets evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And at the very top here, single crochet, chain 3, 1, 2, 3, skip the first chain from your hook, slip stitch, and then slip stitch in the second chain, single crochet back into that same stitch. Now we have just one long edge to go. You'll work 3 single crochets, 1, 2, 3, that's 3 single crochets evenly, 2 single crochets in the next stitch, or the next space, 1, 2, 1 single crochet in the next, 2 single crochets in the next, 1, 2, and then 2 single crochets to get back down this edge, 1 and 2. And you can just slip stitch to finish off this edge. Break off, leaving about 18 inches of yarn again for sewing. I know these ends are a little bit crazy making, but before you start weaving a bunch of stuff in, I want you to take this yellow yarn tail that's closest to this gap, and we're going to just run a few zigzag stitches across here just to make everything nice and secure. I just like knowing there is not a gap in my work. Even though stuffing would probably not come out of that hole, I just like securing everything down. So I'll weave this yarn tail in between my stitches, inside my stitches. I'm gonna make my way to this gap, cross the gap with my needle to kind of cinch it together. You can also travel inside this orange stitch, cross back over. However you do it is fine. You're just trying to do it as invisibly as possible. And see, it only took a couple stitches and this is already nice and closed up. No one would ever know any different. So you can finish weaving in this short yellow end. Remember to leave this long orange tail from the end, leave the long yellow tail from the beginning, and you can weave in these other 3 short tails. When you make the second little flame, you don't have to remember to leave any long tails and just weave all of those in. Next up, we'll take our gray yarn and crochet some lids, starting with this top one. They're both rectangles, much like you've been used to crocheting. The top lid starts with chain 12, and it's 11 single crochets across for 7 rows wide. Break off, leaving an arm length of yarn for a tail for sewing later, and then weave in the other end. The back lid is almost the same. It's the same width, so the same rows. However, it's shorter, so the pattern is just a little bit different. You'll start with a chain 9 and then skip the first chain for 8 single crochets across. You'll still be crocheting 7 rows wide, so it's the same width as the top lid. And as before, break off, leaving an arm length of yarn for sewing later, and then weave in your first end. Keep working with your gray yarn if you'd like to add some little details. These are totally optional. I like to start with these little hinges for the lids that you can see up top here, and they're really simple. We're just going to use chains to create these hinges, so if you want to do this part, go ahead. If it seems really fussy, you can totally skip it. All you need to do is chain 4 and break off, and that's it. The yarn tails on each side don't need to be very long here, maybe just 6 to 8 inches each. You're just going to use these tails to sew the hinges on later, and that's all. Don't forget that you will need 4 of these total. The last detail you can make are these little cute wheels that go on the bottom. You'll also need 4 of them, and we'll still be working in gray yarn. Each wheel is a tiny little ball. We'll crochet a small circle, draw up the edges, and that'll be the very last thing that you need to crochet. Start with either a magic circle or my favorite cheat for the magic circle. You just put on your slip knot and then chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and then slip stitch to the very first chain to form your own tiny ring. It's not magical, but it still works. I find it a little less fussy, and I keep my thumb and my middle finger kind of in the center of the ring so I know where to put my next stitch. Chain 1, and then work 6 single crochets all into the center of this ring. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and to finish, slip stitch to the first single crochet to join. Break off, leaving an 18-inch yarn tail. Put the yarn tail on a tapestry needle, and you'll use this long tail to weave through the 6 remaining stitches and pull to close to create a small ball. To weave through, I only weave through the back loop, and I go from back to front, just that one loop, and pull through. Then on to the next stitch, just the back loop, from back to front, and then pull through. I'll do this one time through each stitch around, and just for extra security, I'll probably go through that very first single crochet back loop again. There are many different ways to weave through remaining stitches. This happens to be a method that I like the aesthetic of, but you can also do whatever method you prefer. When you start pulling on your yarn tail to close up the ball, the wrong side of your stitches might be showing on the outside of the ball, and that is totally okay. For a lot of my amigurumi patterns, I always call for the right side of stitches to show on the outside, but with this tiny little ball, the wrong side is fine. It's easier, and I think it actually just looks really cute this way. After you've pulled through, you can just tie a knot and leave this long tail remaining because you will need that later to sew the wheels onto the dumpster. Then weave in the shorter end. You can go through maybe 1 or 2 stitches along the edge, and then ultimately I'll hide this end inside the ball so you can go right through it. And then trim the end short. Don't forget, you need to make 4 of these wheels total. Before you start assembling your dumpster, this is a good point in time to block pieces if that's what you want to do. I did not block any of my pieces, I hardly ever do, but if having a slight curl or twist in your crocheted panels makes you crazy, blocking can help get rid of that, especially if you're using a natural fiber like wool or cotton. Acrylic can be a little bit more difficult to block. I'm not going to go through that process, but feel free to Google it if you've never done it before. Let's talk about whether or not you want to enforce some of your pieces with the heavyweight interfacing. I for sure am going to reinforce my bottom panel. It's easy to remember which one is the bottom because it has the long yarn tail here. And what you want to do is cut out a shape that's slightly smaller than your actual crochet piece. This is because you want to leave room to put your needle through to sew all these seams together to assemble the whole thing. So your interfacing cannot be going all the way to the edge. This kind of interfacing comes in all different thicknesses. I just try to find the thickest, heaviest stuff. Like, this is not the prettiest cutting ever. No one's gonna see it. That feels pretty good to me. I forgot to tell you guys in the materials section to grab some fabric glue. This is Fabri-Tac. It's one of my favorites because not only does it dry clear, it dries very quickly. So there's not a lot of downtime here. This doesn't have to be perfect either. Just get some nice coverage. You don't really want it to be too thick and squirting out all over the place. You don't want it to seep through your stitches, but you want it to be nice and secure on your crochet piece. Get that nice and centered. Press somewhat firmly, doesn't need too much pressure. And again, it only takes a couple minutes to dry. So in like a minute or two, I would come back and just give this another press and make sure all the glue gets good contact with the crochet and the interfacing. That's all the reinforcing I'm going to do. As we decorate the front and the side panels, I'll tell you when you need to add interfacing if you want to, but for me, this is it. Grab your front panel. This is where we're going to install our safety eyes and our mouth. However, before doing that, if you want to use the interfacing to reinforce this panel, this is a good time to trace that out before there are any eyeballs or a mouth sticking out of it. But don't glue it on yet. Once you figure out where the eyeballs go, you'll have to make a hole in the interfacing so that the posts of the eyes can poke through that. Grab your safety eyes and stick them in about row 4 of the front panel. You can actually put your eyeballs wherever you want, but if you want to put them exactly where I put them, count to row 4 and just start placing them into your front panel. Again, if you've already traced out your interfacing, you want to put it behind here and maybe use a pen to know where this eyeball is going so that you can cut a hole into that interfacing. So then I'd insert the post of my eye through the crochet and the interfacing, snap the back on, add the mouth, and then glue the interfacing on with Fabri-Tac. I'm moving forward without interfacing, so I'm just placing my eyeballs into the front panel, making sure that they are 5 stitches apart and centered. Next, we'll add the mouth using just a little bit of black yarn. You only need like less than a yard, and it's a very tiny mouth centered in between the eyes. I'll be using surface slip stitch, but if you're more comfortable, you can certainly just embroider it on with a regular straight stitch or back stitch. Kind of map out and imagine where you want the mouth to go. Drop your hook in from front to back. I put my slip knot on my hook and then pull through to the front. Again, this is surface slip stitch. And it really only takes 3 stitches. The first one will sort of go down and diagonally toward the center. The next one will go straight across, just 1 stitch to form the very bottom curve of the mouth. I want to adjust your stitches, making sure they aren't too tight or too loose. Here's my second surface slip stitch. And the last one goes kind of up and to the right diagonally. Take my hook out, check out my work. You can sort of give things a tug and shift things around. Make sure that those 3 little stitches are exactly where you want them. Then break off your yarn and pull the tail all the way through toward the front. With this yarn tail on a tapestry needle, poke your needle really close to where the yarn was coming up and put it back down. You just want to make sure that yarn tail goes to the back, but you don't want it to create a visible stitch. That looks good. You can flip it over, tie off to secure, and weave in just a little bit. And again, this is the back, so if it looks a little ugly, that's totally okay. You just don't want any stray black stitches or yarn to show in the front. You just want that to be your extra cute little smile. Also remember to weave in and break off your other yarn tail. Next, you'll sew one handle onto each side panel, but you need to make sure the side panels are facing different directions. You know the bottom edge will have the yarn tail sticking out the bottom of them, and then you'll have the angle, that should be on the top, that angled line, and then a shorter end and a longer end. So definitely make sure these are pointing in different directions before sewing on any of your handles. Here's an idea of where they will go, pretty much just centered on each panel. The stitching on the panel goes vertically and the stitching on the handle goes horizontally. Recall that these handles can be either flatter or more three-dimensional depending on how you flatten it or squeeze it. So squeeze it together and make sure this looks kind of more like a long, skinny sort of baguette shape and not a flat oval shape. Pop in a pin to help make sure this doesn't wiggle around too much. By nature, if you did not block your handle, it will probably twist a little bit, and I feel like that's totally okay to me, but if you want to try to get this as straight as possible, pins will definitely help you. With the long tail on a tapestry needle, you can just start whip stitching this on. I go up through the slip stitch that's on the border of the handle and just try to make sure that all of my stitches stay really close to the edge of the handle so it makes your seaming as invisible as possible. If you want to reinforce your side panels, trace these shapes, keeping in mind that they need to be slightly smaller than the crochet pieces, and then glue them down. Here's where things start to get a little bit more exciting. We're going to start sewing some of this dumpster together. This is my bottom panel. It has my interfacing on it. Take your long yarn tail and put your tapestry needle on it. It doesn't really matter what order you sew these panels on. I kind of indicate that in the pattern like I give you an order, but you could do it any which way you want. I'm starting at the back here. So I'll want to sew this edge, this is the longer edge, the 12 single crochet edge of my bottom panel to a 12 crochet edge of the back panel. Sewing these two pieces together. Eventually it'll look like this. But right now it's going to look like this. However you sew this is fine. I'm going to use whip stitches because they're easy and it's just easier for me to hold if I fold this over the bottom panel and seam from this perspective. So it's the same amount of stitches you're lining up, so you can just do one whip stitch for each stitch across. Really easy. If you have other favorite fancier joining techniques, you're welcome to use those. A whip stitch seam is somewhat visible, but it's never really bothered me. As we are sewing this together, some people might be wondering why I have so many separate panels. A lot of these could be crocheted in one longer panel, and then there would be less sewing. And I thought about that for a long time. Since there's some centering and placement on the front panel with the face and the side panels with the handles, to me it just felt easier to wrap your brain around how to place everything if you're just dealing with one panel at a time. Plus, when we're sewing these separate panels together, I feel like it's easier to create a sense of an edge. If a lot of these panels were crocheted in one big piece, the edges might end up looking a little bit more rounded. And essentially we're trying to mimic something that has really hard angles, even though this is a very soft project. So I finished sewing the back panel to my bottom panel. We're gonna keep going and attach a side panel. Make sure you grab the right side panel. You want the long, taller edge here to match up with the back. The shorter edge will be for the front. You want to make sure that handle is showing on the outside. Eventually it'll look like this. I'm going to sew this bottom edge of the side panel to this bottom edge of the bottom panel. Save this tail, even though we're not using it to sew now, we are going to use it later. So flip this over again like this. If you do a lot of sewing, these two pieces are wrong sides facing. I'm not a sewist, so it takes me a little bit to think about right side and wrong side and which sides are facing what. So take these two corners and seam them. And again, I'm just using a whip stitch. Next up is the front panel. I want to make sure the face is facing the outside, and that the orientation of the face is right. Eyes on top, mouth in the middle. Again, with wrong sides together, I'm going to seam this bottom edge. And this last one, which is our last side panel, again lining up the tall edge of that side panel with our back panel, making sure the short end of it matches up with the front panel, making sure the handle is showing on the outside, and then seaming the bottom edge to the bottom panel. You can tie off this yarn tail. The next step will be to seam up all of these side edges to make more of an open-topped box. That's where these annoying leftover tails on the side panels will come in handy. Grab any random one and thread it through your tapestry needle. And just like a box, fold those up. Sorry, all these tails are very annoying, I am not gonna lie. Line these up. You can use pins if it makes it easier. I might throw a pin in at the end here just so I know that these pieces aren't sliding around. And then seam up these corners. I feel like I have some space here even behind my yarn tail, so I might backtrack a little and make sure that little gap is seamed up. And then I'll go back toward this direction where I have my pin. and get to the top, tie off, and weave in this end. If you want to get really particular about it, you can make sure that your knot is tied on the inside and you won't be able to see it at all. Seam up these other 3 edges in the same way. It's definitely looking more like a 3-dimensional object here. I know it's super squishy and super wobbly. Once we get some stuffing in him, his shape will get a little bit more recognizable. With the open hole of the top panel on the left, grab your flame bucket piece. And just so it just makes it easier for me to think about alignment, I take this long yarn tail on the corner of the bucket here and I align it with the top left corner of this gap. And I fit the pieces around. It's going to be a little weird and it might look really odd on camera, but we're just trying to seam and match the edge of the opening on the top with the top edge of the bucket so that the bucket will be sewn in and stick out of the bottom here. So I know everything's like really squishy and floppy and kind of hard to envision. Just get that long yarn tail from the flame bucket onto your tapestry needle, and just to get yourself going, attach this top corner on the flame bucket to this top corner inside this hole in the top panel. Let's just get that corner situated. And I know that this live stitch is not helping clarify what everything looks like. If you want to here, use pins. You can line up the top edge here. Remember, for me, 5 stitches across the top of the bucket is the top edge. So I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And stick my pin at the end of that 5th stitch, and I'll pin it into the right corner here. It's not pinning that well, but it'll do. And then for me, 9 stitches down the bucket was the length of this edge. So I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and know that I want this bottom corner after that 9th stitch to correlate with this front right corner of the top panel here, or the hole inside the top panel. And then 5 more stitches across the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After that 5th stitch is my next corner. Easier to come into this way. I love pins. I always pin myself. And technically, there should be 9 stitches here on this edge. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that did work out correctly. You can just use a simple whip stitch to go all the way around this edge. When you've gone all the way around, you can go ahead and tie a knot and weave in just a little bit. Your top panel should look something like this when we're finished installing that little bucket for our flames. I still have my live stitch up here in the upper left corner, and we will install the flames next, but first we have to put the flames together. Let's do the big flame first. You have one piece with 2 tails and one piece with no tails. It doesn't matter which one goes on top of the other. Sometimes if I think one looks prettier than the other, I'll put that one in the front, but you can decide they should essentially be exactly the same. So I'm putting this one on top, and to sew them together we're going to use our long orange tail and whip stitch all the orange together. And I don't feel like you need pins here because these pieces are identical and you can just match them up stitch for stitch. And here, so that my seams are not super like thick and bunchy, I'll sew together 2 loops and not a total of 4, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I'll just sew through whatever at the bottom here just to get myself going. But for this next stitch, on this back piece you would have 2 loops, and then on the front piece you'd have 2 more loops, and it makes for a pretty chunky seam. So what I do is I take the 2 loops that are closest to the middle, so it's the front loop of the back piece and the back loop of the front piece, and I do that all the way around. You don't have to do this. It's fine if you go through all 4 of the loops or 2 other loops. This is just sort of what I found was easier and the nicest. But if it's too annoying for you, just go ahead and whip stitch all 4 of those loops together. So just take this all the way around. When you've finished seaming all the orange bits, you can tie that off and weave this orange tail inside. We're saving this yellow tail for sewing the flame to the bucket, but if you want, you can grab a teeny bit of stuffing right now and see what this little guy looks like. It's not going to get super round. It really is just going to be like a little pillow. But you can play more with how much stuffing you want to put in once we start sewing this down. But for now, just give yourself an idea of what this looks like. This keeps sticking to my hand. Okay, there you go. That. We're going to do the exact same thing to the little flame. Now you can arrange the flames inside the bucket before sewing them down. And put the big one in the back and the little one in the front. It should fit pretty perfectly with no gaps in the front and back, kind of not many gaps on the side. Of course there are some little holes and spots here because these are 3D objects with kind of wiggly shapes, but for the most part it will fill that bucket pretty well. And if you feel like your flames don't have enough stuffing, you can go ahead and play with the volume of those as well. But for the most part, I think this looks pretty good. One thing before you sew these down, if you want your flames to be removable after your whole toy is constructed so you can put other things in this bucket, you can actually just use your long yellow tails here and seam up the bottoms of these, and you wouldn't even have to seam them down into this bucket. And that's a pretty easy way to deal with it too, so you don't have to sew these in. But I will sew them in just in case you do want your flames to be permanent. I'm going to do the big flame in the back first. So I'll get my tapestry needle threaded right now. stick this here. You can imagine on the bottom we have kind of an echo of this rectangle that's on top right here on the bottom. So I'm going to think about using only the back half here for my stitches for the big flame so I can reserve some space up in the front for the little flame. This part can be a little funky, which is again why I developed a bucket, because it's just really easy to then access the bottom and not worry if the bottom is going to look ugly with your stitching. So while I have the flame where I want it, I'm using some fingers at the bottom to support the bottom. Just go ahead and poke your needle through the bottom of the bucket to get your first stitch going. And some of this is just going to be kind of intuitive and rotating the pieces around and seeing where your stitches are. And if anything is feeling weird or crooked or in the wrong place, just take your stitches out. I kind of will do like a couple stitches and then step back and see if I like how things are going. I don't like sewing too far and then deciding that I don't like it. You can check the bottom to see what that looks like. I feel like I'm getting really close to the edge here. I want to make sure that my stitches stay on the bottom. The other thing you could do, oops, let me just pull my needle back up. The other thing you could do is pop the bucket inside out, basically, so you can really see the bottom and what's happening here. I did this for my first go, and I feel like it still made my stitches crooked, and I don't know, it wasn't quite as helpful as I thought. I was like, oh, this is genius. You just pop it upside down and you have total access to this bottom of the bucket. But I don't know, somehow I thought I was sewing straight lines and I wasn't, and it was kind of like a false security. So I feel like if you really want to know what this looks like, at least you need to pop it back in and check the placement. Because mine ended up being like a little diagonal, which is fine. It still looked totally fine. You'd never know. It's just that I knew, and it kind of bugged me a little bit. See, it looks a little bit crazy down here. It even looks like I missed stitches in the corner, but I guess I just didn't go all the way through to the bottom, and that's totally fine also. But this is definitely what I was saving us from. That's why we have this bottom bucket, to catch all of our weird, ugly stitches. I'm going to shove the smaller flame in here just to make sure everything still fits. That's probably a good idea too. Everything looks good. I'll finish sewing this seam down. You can tie a knot at the bottom. Okay, that wasn't too bad, right? You can thread the tail on your little flames. Pop this guy in. And then sew this one down the same way as you did the first one. I'm going to pause for a second because I do feel like the little flame isn't really going where I want it to. There's so much room in front of it here, so much blue space. I think I'm going to undo this front row of stitches and make sure that I'm just bringing them a little bit more forward. That's just me being super picky. Like, I know there's going to be a gap up front, and that will bother me, even though probably no one would be able to see it. I would just know. So that's why it's good to check. And it's okay to have to redo some things. It's totally normal. Can't always get things the way we want them on the first try. In fact, I think I just have to move up. Well, let's see. This side stitching is also quite far back in the bucket. I might have just started the piece in the wrong spot. I think that looks pretty good. Looks like it was just the second stitch that started going astray. Redo. These aren't super secure. They can kind of flop around a little bit, but at least they won't fall out of the dumpster. If you feel better about it, you can pop a drop of hot glue right here or fabric glue and press them together, but I usually just let them be separate. This is the time when we get to start putting all of this together. So grab your, whatever you want to call this part. It's the open box part of your dumpster. And let's get a little stuffing in there. Where most of your stuffing is going to be on the right side. You need to leave room for the flames to sit in here. It's not going to take a lot of stuffing, especially if you want to maintain a somewhat squarish shape. The more you stuff this, the rounder it's going to get. Plop this top panel on top of here. It's all going to feel a little bit weird and floppy and annoying to deal with, but once we start getting some stitches down, it'll be much easier. So imagine, you don't have to imagine, this is what we're actually going to do. We're going to connect the top edge of the top panel with the top or open edge of the rest of the dumpster. It's really easy, right? It's just 4 sides. What we're gonna do is a little bit funky because I don't just want to seam these together with whip stitch. When you look at the toy, we have this ridge here that kind of sticks out, and I want to recreate that while we're seaming this up. So what we're gonna do is sew these 2 pieces together using single crochet. Single crochet will give us a little bit more dimension. It will create that outer ridge that we're looking for. The other thing to keep in mind is we want the wrong side of that single crochet round to show on top. When you start single crocheting pieces together, you'll notice that it'll kind of orient a seam one way or another. And if we have the wrong side facing up, this plane on top will look really smooth and uninterrupted, and the ridge will actually occur on the side. If we did it the other way around, there'd be more of a ridge happening on the top, and it just doesn't create the same ridge orientation as this. So that said, I feel like sometimes explaining it makes it sound more difficult, but I'm trying to make it a little bit easier. It will definitely help to pin the corners together so your pieces don't shift around. Corner to corner, this is pretty easy to match up because you have 12 single crochets that made up the top of the back and 12 single crochets that made up the top of the top panel. So that's super easy to gauge as far as placement of this single crochet round you're about to create. This edge gets a little different because it's sort of the edge of rows sewn together or stitched together to another edge of rows. Plus it's not the same number of rows, so you want to just match up the corner here. The corner where the front meets the side panel, and then just the corner of your top panel. This front seam should still be 12 across. And match up this corner. And pop a pin in. And then you don't really need to pin down this top corner because we're going to start putting our hook in there and attaching that down anyway. You can take a look at your guy. You can see like the front face is feeling a little bit squishy. There's probably not enough stuffing in here right now. We can also stuff as we go. You can seam down this first line and then we can check things out and stick in more stuffing. I think I'm going to do that before I proceed with any more stuffing, just so things are a little more situated and less kind of floating around. Okay. I have my hook back onto the top panel here. I'm going to chain one and turn. To get the stitches facing the way that I want them, I need to make sure my hook is going through the back panel first, then through the top panel. Then I know that it's all in the right direction. So back here I can see the first single crochet at the top here. Insert my hook, and then I'll insert my hook into the first single crochet in this corner on the top panel. Then I can complete the first single crochet of this round. We'll do that again for the next stitch. Through the back panel first, then the top panel, complete the single crochet. 12 single crochets evenly across this back edge. Just one single crochet in each stitch. That's 12. You can see how I was talking about the top remains really flat, but we get this little extra lip on the side, which would not occur if we were working this round with the right side of the stitches facing up. I'm going to try to get a little bit more stuffing in this guy. You kind of want to visualize getting a little bit of stuffing between the bucket and the back of the dumpster, and I would say the same for the front. Try to get a little layer between the front panel with the face and the outside of the bucket. I just want to make sure the left side of his face looks just as stuffed as the right side of his face. It's okay if he's not perfect, but we can try to do little things to make it as close to our intended vision. It's definitely helping to put a little stuffing in front of the flame bucket there, and put a little bit more on this side too. I really think of it as sculpting at this point. I'm kind of trying to get a little bit of stuffing underneath the bucket, but not too much because I don't want it to pop up. And of course, if someone is playing with this toy, all the stuffing is going to get really rearranged and it's going to look really kind of melty and funky. And you know what? That's just the beauty of a handmade crochet toy. It's going to have some personality from artist to artist. Feeling like there's a section here that needs a little something. It can be kind of hard to access. You can just scooching some stuffing under there with my finger. Just a lot of scooching. I guess there's an opening here too. Can get some like that. Probably put still some more on the side. So I just like to do a little bit at a time, because it's more annoying to try to pull it out after it's all stuck together inside there. Just pulling little bits, tucking them in little spots that I feel like need a little filling in. And give them a 360. Feeling like this feels a little squishy. Get a little bit more down in that corner. Just usually like your finger. Just use your finger. to squish it in, fill in all those spots. You'll have a little bit more opportunity to fill in too, but as we sew up more of the sides, you're just going to have more difficult access to these. So figure stuff as you go. Try to get it as nice as you can, kind of right off. And then if there's an emergency stuffing situation later, you can figure it out. But right now you have the most access to all the spots. I want to be careful to overstuff this too, because I want the top to appear like it's flat. It's looking pretty good to me. He's still really squishy. There's not a lot of stuffing in him. That's the way that I designed it and the way that I like it, but if you want to try to stuff it more and see what happens, you certainly can. I think the danger is, because of how I designed the flames, if you stuff this a lot, these will just pop out and it won't give that illusion that they're popping out from the inside of the dumpster. So you can also play with how much stuffing you want to put in there, and you can let me know what the results are like. In this corner, which is a little bunchy, in the corner I'm going to work 3 single crochets to get myself around the corner here. So 1, and then in the same stitch, 2, back in the same stitch, 3. So you want to step back and make sure that's the spot that I want to be the corner. That looks pretty good. Then down this edge, try to work 10 single crochets evenly. If you do more or less, write it down. Write down the number because you'll want it to be the same when you get to this edge. You want to try to get this as symmetrical as possible. Again, it's crocheting, it's soft, it's squishy. There will be some inconsistencies, but if we can at least know that our numbers are the same, we know that, we did our best to get it as close as possible. So here I have 1, 2, 8, 9, 10. This is definitely a spot to do a stuffing check. If you want any more, or if something's looking puffy and you need to pull some out. Let's take a look. This I feel like is a little denty. I can put a little bit more in there. Maybe it's just tiny, tiny little additions at a time. In the corner here again, we're going to work 3 single crochets in 1 stitch. One, 2 stitches, 2, 1 set, 3. And work your way across the front edge. 1, 2, 3 single crochets right into the corner again. 1, 2 in the same spot, 3 in the same spot, and then your last seam should be 10 single crochets right back where you started. Smile is still a little bit crooked. I'm just going to accept him for his eccentricity. And now you'll see like we still have a little bit of gap in the corner because we need to work our 3 single crochets to complete this. I don't have a lot of room left here, so I'm just going to go back in the stitch I just worked, give it 2 more single crochets for a total of 3 in that one spot, and then slip stitch to the very first single crochet of the round to join. And that looks pretty good. Break off. And this is your last chance to stick in any stuffing that you want. Let's see, I feel like I'm pretty comfy with how this looks and feels. Yeah, it's kind of a funny like whoop upward shape up here, but I'm not gonna worry too much about that. Time to sew on our gray lids. Grab the top lid, which is the longer one. And this should fit pretty well across the top here. And I'm going to be honest, anytime I crochet, the gauge or the tension that I work in might change from day to day. Maybe it has to do with the weather. I've changed the pattern for this top lid several times because it's always ended up too wide or too long, and then I'll fix it, and then when I make a second sample, it's different again. So it looks like right now it's kind of a little bit wider than I want it. I would love for there to be a teal border seen on this outside edge too, because on the toy there's still a little bit of this lip showing. The gray doesn't go all the way to the edge. So I might see what it looks like to take out 1 row of this top lid. And there are other iterations of this pattern where I had this actually wider, or I guess longer here, longer across the top of the dumpster. And in this case, I feel like it's pretty good. You can still see some teal around the edge, and it's not too much. Sometimes these things just look different every time you make them, and I just want to let you know that that's normal and happens to me. I'm not a robot, and I don't crochet the exact same way every time I do the exact same pattern. So let's see what this looks like. Taking out 1 row, seeing if I like the look of that better, and I totally do. I like that, you know, this is nudged up right against the flames, but I can still see some teal around the outside edge here. I'm going to retrim this and pull this tail through. So my piece right now is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 single crochets this way, the long way, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows this way. You might find out that you'll have to fiddle with this a little bit, and it's a good practice. It's a quick, easy piece to play around with. What makes a piece wider? What makes a piece longer? I like to pin this down a little bit, mostly in the middle, like right smack dab in the middle, because when I sew this down, I don't want to whip stitch the edges down like all the way close, because I feel like that makes the lid look really flat, and I kind of want it. See, this isn't flat, it has some thickness. And if I sew slightly away from the edge, slightly like inside the border of my gray lid, it lets the edge pop out a little bit more. So I'll just be using like a straight stitch across the top, or a top stitch. I will not be whip stitching the edges down. If you want to add the hinge detail, I would do that now before sewing the lid down, because it'll be easier to access the back of this to tie down any ends of our hinges. It'll just make a cleaner look and give you easier access. Grab one of your hinges. Remember, they're just these little pieces that are 4 chains long, and thread one end. I found that 4 works for me. If you start putting one of these in and you're like, this is too long or this is too short, it's super easy just to either do 2 or 3 chains or 6 or 7 chains. You can switch it up according to how much room you left up here or how tightly you chain. I would try to chain pretty tightly on these just to keep them nice and neat. I'm taking a look on the toy to see how this is attached. You can see that the hinge does not cross over, it does not cross over the lip. It comes up from behind the lid and just kind of goes back down to the top lid before the edge. So we're going to do the same thing. Try to envision, you can use pins if you want, where your 2 hinges are going to go. So I think it's like about here. Maybe here. Doesn't seem right. Doesn't have to be exact, it just has to look good on your toy. I think that seems okay. Be more like here. Here. Okay. With your needle, figure out where you want your first hinge to go. I'm kind of going maybe a row and a half in and a row and a half down. So I would stick my tapestry needle into the lid from top to bottom or front to back and just pull the tail through, don't pull the chains through. So I have my 4 chains still sitting on top of the lid. And secure this tail to the back here so that it's hidden. Just tie a knot. You can weave that in a little bit just so it doesn't pop its way out. And trim. Now you can thread the other tail from the same hinge onto your tapestry needle. And this will go through the top of the teal dumpster. Okay, but don't go over the rim. We're still staying on top. Just a direct line, like a straight line that goes over and around the top of the lid, back through the top of the dumpster. Bring the tip of the tapestry needle forward. And the tip of this chain, let's zoom in. The tip of this chain should not go through the top of the dumpster. It should just sit right on the surface of it. You can see how that little chain, that little length of chain kind of makes a little loop around the top of the lid here. And I just want to secure this tail. You can either secure it to the lid, the back of the lid, or the top of the dumpster. I've done it either way. For some reason right now it's just easier for me to access the top of the dumpster, so I'm going to do that. However you secure it is fine, as long as you can't see what's happening. Everything will be hidden. And I'll hide the tail a little bit inside the dumpster. Trim. And then we put that back. You can't see any of those tails. It's admittedly a little bit fussy of a process, but it's a really nice little detail to add that hinge. Go ahead and do that on this side as well. Now that you have your hinges installed, you can go ahead and use this long gray tail to sew around the border of the lid. Again, keeping in mind not to sew the edge all the way. You want your stitching to always be maybe about a row or less than a row away from the edge. This top lid looks great. Our hinges look really cute. Now let's do the back lid. Let's take a look at the back lid on the vinyl toy. Looking at the hinges, so they come from the top of the lid and go back down into the top of the dumpster. And just due to the nature of crochet, we can't mimic this exactly. Our hinge will go all the way to the back and behind the back lid. It's just how we're going to be able to secure this and how it's going to make sense. When we pin this, oh, also, remember how I took out one row for this top lid? I also ended up taking out a row on this back lid so that these two pieces would be the same width. Sometimes it comes out differently depending on how you're crocheting that day, so just match things up together, see how they look on the dumpster, if you want to make any changes. Especially with these lids, it's super easy. It's just a very easy pattern to either make longer or shorter or wider or thinner. We're going to pin this with just a little bit of the gray lid kind of coming up, farther up than the back of the teal part of the dumpster. You can see that's what happens on the toy as well. The gray comes up above the teal a bit. So we want to mimic that a little bit. I have a habit of making it stick out too much, which makes the hinge have to travel too far. So just let it peek out just a tiny little bit, like barely a row. Make sure you like the look of it from all sides, all angles, and then pin. Not pinning all the way to the top here because I want room to play with the hinge attaching. Thread another hinge on your tapestry needle. I'll begin by inserting my needle. So I guess decide where you want your two hinges. Maybe like here and here. Poke your needle in through the top of the dumpster, pretty close to the edge. You don't want it to come too far in. Just keep it on this lip here, like this single crochet row, and pull all the way through. Remember, don't pull the chain through, just pull the tail through until the chain is sitting nicely at the top of the dumpster. I'm going to spin this around and tie a knot here on the dumpster to secure. The lid should cover this bit so you won't be able to see this knot. And then weave that in a little bit. Thread the other end of the hinge onto your tapestry needle to make sure this is lined up correctly again, nice and flat. And then loop the hinge over the top of the lid. Look at the back here, and just sort of wherever this naturally falls against the lid is where I'm going to insert my needle again. Only through the lid, not all the way into the dumpster. Pull through. If you like the look of that, you can go ahead and secure that tail behind the lid. Attach the second hinge in the same way, and then take your long gray tail and sew down the lid here just the same way you did the top one. The final touch here would be adding the wheels on the bottom. Flip your dumpster over, grab one of your wheels, and If you've reinforced the bottom like I have, it's really easy to see where those corners are. You want to put it, slightly away from the edge, not right in the corner, just kind of slightly inward. And imagine that all 4 of your wheels would be placed in a similar way. You could totally glue these on if you wanted. Just remember to weave in this long tail, but I prefer to sew these guys down. Sew on the other 3 wheels in the same way.
I am so proud of you. You finished crocheting your very own dumpster fire friend. It's gonna look ultra cute on your bookshelf, on your coffee table, on your desk, on your bedside table. It also makes a really cute gift for a friend who might need a pick-me-up. If you post finished photos of your projects, please remember to tag me and Truck. We would love to see them and repost them. I am Twinkie Chan on Instagram. Truck is 100soft. If you have any questions about the pattern or just any fun comments about your experience, please feel free to comment below or reach out to me on social. Otherwise, have so much fun, and I can't wait to see all of your dumpster fires.